As India celebrates Republic Day, we remember the horrors of British imperialism, of the thousands of crores of rupees looted from India, of the millions of Indians killed, and of the divide and rule policy that not only led to the partition of India, but which still causes so much tension today. Hello and welcome. Last year, Shashi Tharoor made a speech to the Oxford Union about the way in which Britain had looted and almost destroyed India. That speech went viral on the net, and now Tharoor has followed it up with this, An Era of Darkness, a book that finally establishes what a blight on human civilization the British Empire really was. Earlier this week, I sat down with Shashi and I asked him to present his case to the viewers of Virtuosity. You tell the story of how you wrote the book in your introduction about the speech at Oxford. So tell it again for us.
Well, you know, Veer, I made the speech really quite routinely. I didn't think of it as a big deal. It was fun. Audience liked it. We won the debate. I pushed off and forgot about it. Then a few weeks later, they posted it on the web, on YouTube. And the blessed thing went viral after I tweeted it. And it got so much of attention and so many articles were written about it and so on that my publisher, David Davidar, whom you know, called me and said, look, you've got to turn this into a book. To which I said, but why? Doesn't everyone know this already? And he said, no, because if they did know it already, your speech wouldn't have gone viral.
Let's take some of the stories about the British Empire. One story is that there was no India before the British came and the British created India. That's not true, right?
That's absolutely not true. First of all, going back to the Vedic days, there was the idea of Bharatvarsh as this land between the Himalayas and the ocean. Adi Shankara, from my state of Kerala, traveled all the way to Kashmir in the north, to Dwarka in the west, to Puri in the east.
And this is what, 7th century?
What, 7th century. So first of all, you've got this civilizational notion, what the Harvard professor Diana Eck calls the sacred geography of India, knitted together by tracts of pilgrimage. But it wasn't a purely Hindu idea alone, because Maulana Azad has written about how Muslims showing up at the Hajj would be greeted by the Arabs and Muslims from other parts of the world as Hindi. Whether they were Pathans or Tamils, they came from a recognizable civilizational space. And again, politically and territorially, many rulers tried to reflect that space. So you go right back to Chandragupta Maurya and Ashoka in the 4th century BC, and they're trying to reunite the whole subcontinent through the force of arms. Less successfully, the Guptas a few centuries later, or Vijayanagar in the south. Then you've got, of course, the Mughals, who are the next lot to get as much of the territory, with the exception of a tip of the peninsula, covered with their administration. So the British were merely following something that every big, powerful Indian ruler had sought to do, but largely been unable to do because of the limitations on communication, transport, travel, etc. in the earlier days. I'm convinced that if the British hadn't knit the whole place together, some Indian ruler could easily have done so using 19th century communications technologies which weren't available to previous Indian rulers.
The second idea that the British propagated successfully is that India was this land of primitive savages and that they came along and imposed civilization on us. In fact, India was one of the richest countries in the world in those days.
Absolutely. In fact, it was the richest country in the world till about Aurangzeb's time, and by the time the British had a significant presence, it was the second richest after China. 23% of global GDP was being generated by India. We were the world's largest producer and exporter of textiles. We had a thriving shipbuilding industry, or more than one, because it was Bengal and the West Coast and the Southeast. And on top of that, of course, we had steel, which is something that I didn't realize. We were the world pioneers in
I actually didn't realize that till I read your book.
There you are.
And your things happened before the Middle Ages even.
Absolutely. The Ukku steel, which
and our swords were like Valerian steel and Game of Thrones. They were known for all over the world as being the best swords.
Absolutely. Because they were the best swords, when the British soldiers came here, and of course they had the superior gunpowder, they shot our soldiers. They would dismount from their horses and steal the swords of the Indian soldiers, because our steel was better than anything available of any sword manufactured in Europe. So that was the kind of tradition we had. And all of that, of course, the British systematically dismantled and destroyed.
That's the other claim. You suggest, as indeed did Jawaharlal Nehru long ago, that what the British did was not allow the Industrial Revolution to flourish in India. They took our resources, our raw materials, sent them to Lancashire or wherever, and benefited from Indian resources and launched their own Industrial Revolution. The British have denied that, but explain that to me.
No, no, it's absolutely the correct analysis, because there's evidence for all of this. They systematically destroyed Indian industry, such as in the case of the textiles breaking the looms, and at least one incident that's been documented by a Dutch observer, cutting off the thumbs of the weavers so they couldn't weave again. Really horrendous. Dhaka was depopulated in the early 19th century because of the destruction of the textile industry. Similarly, shipbuilding, they squeezed it through passing laws and regulations, except when they needed ships because their own ships were being sunk in the Napoleonic Wars. They suddenly allowed these Indian ships to come. Otherwise, ships made in India were so much better than British ships. Our ships lasted an average of 23, 24 years, whereas British ships made of pine and fir lasted only 6 or 7 years. Essentially, what the British did was to bar ships made in India from the lucrative trade to London, so eventually no one had an interest in making those ships in India. Dismantle the industry that way. Similarly, steel we've talked about. So you've got a situation where they thwarted Indian industry. Then, because they control the land and the ports, they imposed tariffs and duties on anything Indians produced and lifted all tariffs and duties on anything that they imposed upon us. So their goods were cheaper. I mean, I've found anecdotes in the literature going back to the 17th and 18th centuries where English shopkeepers are trying to pass off shoddy European goods as made in India, because made in India had the cachet of being the highest quality textiles, muslins, linens, cloths, and so on in the world. That industry was being destroyed by the British and supplanted by the cheaper machine-made manufacturers of Britain. So when the British say, or apologists for the British say, look, it's not our fault, you had a big chunk of GDP in a pre-industrial world, when industrialization came, you guys missed the bus. Well, the answer is we missed the bus because you, the Brits, threw us under its wheels.
Yeah. The other thing you say, which I found very interesting, is that we think of India as now, particularly post-colonial India, as being this incredibly corrupt society, whereas the British imposed a system of honest laws. You say in the book, and that's interesting, that there was actually a lot of corruption right from the days of Robert Clive in the British Empire.
Absolutely. The East India Company was a totally dishonest, corrupt, rapacious institution that robbed, stole, bribed, took bribes, emptied treasuries, and very often with the sanction of the official establishment of the board of directors of the East India Company in London. Warren Hastings would essentially loot large sums of money from the territories that he annexed to the company's domains, and then say to them, look, for my pains, I'd like to keep £100,000, and the remaining 250,000 I'll send to you to distribute amongst yourselves. And of course, the British directors are only too happy to do that. It was completely systematic loot. But even worse, I mean, they would, for example, station soldiers, quote unquote, for your protection in principalities, in exchange for which the protected Maharaja or Nawab or whatever would have to pay such vast sums of money, ridiculously disproportionate to the expenses incurred. It was like a protection racket that the mafia in America perfected, where they would go to a restaurant owner and say, you know, to prevent your thing being burned down by the mafia, we'll protect you, you pay us so much. It's basically a form of blackmail. That's what the East India Company did. And when you talk about having brought in rule of law and so on, the sad truth is that the law by the British was applied with great attentiveness to the skin color of the defendant. So that if you just take, for example, the crime of murder, hundreds of Indians were killed by English people. One of the most common deaths was white men kicking their servants to death. And practically nobody was punished. They were at most given
you actually
fines.
Instances of people kicking servants and rupturing their spleens.
Rupturing their spleens, and the excuse given in the British courts was, oh, all these Indians have enlarged spleens because they're so prone to malaria. And that's why it was not because of the Englishman kicking him that he died. He died because his spleen was so easily ruptured. That was the argument made. And in the entire 200 years of British rule, only 3 cases exist of Englishmen being actually executed for having killed Indians. Whereas an Indian, so much as raising a voice or a hand against the English, could be hanged, quartered, blown from the mouths of cannons, or at the very least shipped off in exile to the Andamans or earlier to Singapore in Southeast Asia. That was the kind of horrendous unevenness in the application of
the so-called rule of law. One of the things I found interesting about the book is when you talk about the caste system, you do not deny that we always had a caste system, but you're suggesting the British made the caste system almost a part of law, and it solidified and became much more rigid during that period. I hadn't actually heard that before.
Right. I would even argue we had castes, but we didn't have a caste system.
Explain that.
We had hundreds of castes and subcastes, and they were very fuzzy. First of all, in terms of how they were settled in Indian society, which also varied enormously geographically, and also in terms of your capacity to move within them. So, for example, the Kayas, who were originally a Shudra caste, by learning Persian and becoming scribes in the courts, they rose up the social ladder and became hugely important administrators, and indeed continued, as you know, in the British days as Indian civil servants.
And the ICS and the IAS.
ICS, IAS, all of that. The caste system, in the sense of the solid Chaturvarna approach that the British had, actually didn't exist anywhere. What the British did when, in the 18th century, they had controlled large enough chunks of territory to want to figure out how to rule this place, Warren Hastings summoned a dozen Brahmin Pandits and told them to write what was published as the Code of Gentoo Laws. And the Brahmins essentially wrote something which privileged their position in society, and which at the same time, as far as possible, found doctrinal justification in ancient texts that may not actually have been heeded in practice. So Manusmriti existed, but there's very little evidence that everybody in India lived according to the tenets of the Manusmriti. There are these documents. It doesn't mean that that's how society actually functioned, but the British believed it did because the Brahmins told them so. There's one skeptic, William Jones, the founder of the Asiatic Society, who said very suspiciously, these Brahmins are sort of making up the laws as it suits them, and I think where they can't find it in the text, they will invent it for ready money. But Jones, poor chap, died young, and his skepticism was not thereafter repeated elsewhere. The British accepted all of this wholesale and then imposed it on the rest of us. One of the interesting things about the way in which the caste system and all other identity divisions worked in the British Raj was not only that the British created these very immutable identities. You were stuck with the identity you were given. So you were a member of a criminal tribe. Whether you liked it, you may have been a decent guy.
That was bizarre. Wasn't it this whole idea of martial races, criminal tribes?
Criminal tribes, martial races, all of these are totally absurd British notions thrust upon us. And it was unfortunately accompanied by a pattern of self-identification, where people were encouraged to identify themselves along these divisions that the British had very clearly worked out. Now, there's a lot of contemporary scholarship on this, so I'm really standing on the shoulders of very, very fine scholars who documented this in more detail than I can in the book, but I've cited them in my endnotes. And there's a lot of material out there that demonstrates how the British went ahead and did this. You see, the whole business of classifying, categorizing, was a way of controlling. So the census was an instrument of British colonial control. And when the British started the census process, they were essentially forcing people to identify themselves in categories that the British could understand and sort of file away. That's essentially what happened. And we actually see it in other bizarre instances. For example, there's no recorded Shia-Sunni problem in Lucknow until the British came.
I want to come to that because one of the things you say is we were taught in school that the British practiced a policy of divide and rule.
Absolutely.
And we always thought this was just one of the things in Indian history books. But there are instances in your book of the extent to which the Hindu-Muslim divide was created, and if not created, certainly exaggerated by the British. Explain that.
No, created too. But before I come to the larger Hindu-Muslim divide, let me just finish on the Sunni-Shia thing because it's so surprising. People don't realize that up to the days of Wajid Ali Shah of Shatranj Ke Khiladi fame, the Muharram commemoration in Lucknow was done jointly by Shia, Sunnis and Hindus every year, and there was no trouble, no problem. The British came and said, no, this is a Shia thing. Muharram has to be done only by Shias. Shias are in charge, and within a couple of years, the Sunnis are objecting to something, the Shias are insulting the Sunnis, trouble starts. No record of it before the British did it. So this whole British thing of, we'll create these silos because Indians belonging in these categories. Now, on the divide and rule, it really started after 1857 when Hindu and Muslim soldiers united under the banner of the poor, feeble Mughal monarch in order to fight against the common enemy, the British. And the British said, this won't work, we have to separate these guys. And Lord Elphinstone wrote a celebrated memo in which he said that divide et impera was the ancient Roman maxim and it shall be ours. Divide and rule should be the policy we follow. And as a result, the myriad instances of systematic efforts to create a separate religious consciousness and give it a political coloration. There's no question anymore, for example, that they paid to start the Muslim League. as a rival to the Indian National Congress. Even though the Indian National Congress was a very constitutionalist-minded body, full of lawyers and gentlemen who wanted to be, to enjoy the rights of Englishmen, because they really were brown Englishmen. But even that was too much for the British. They had to divide the national movement by encouraging the creation of the Muslim League. And example after example of this nature, they were quite deliberate and went right up to the Second World War, when, as you know, the Congress Party won 9 provinces in the elections of 1937. The Muslim League didn't even win a majority of the seats reserved for Muslims, that only Muslims could vote for Muslim candidates. Even there, the Muslim League didn't win. So the British they saw this as a setback until, of course, the Congress very obligingly resigned their positions of power in protest against Lord Linlithgow declaring war without consulting Indian elected leaders. So what did the British do? They promptly started giving these positions to Muslim leaders who had not been elected to them, so that the Muslim League could use its power of patronage and influence to build up its support base, which of course the League was able to do, even more so after the Quit India movement, when the entire Congress establishment, leaders and workers, ended up in jail. With the result of the Muslim League multiplied its membership from a few lakhs in 1939 to 2 crores by the end of the Second World War. And when the congressmen were finally released and came blinking into the sunlight of the post-war era, they were totally outclassed by a very well organized, very effective Muslim League, which the British had explicitly, according to their own admission, supported, encouraged, and helped grow to a position where they could deliver partition.
There's still a lot more to come after the break, including the villainy of that murderous old racist Winston Churchill. Don't go away. Welcome back. I'm talking to Shashi Tharoor about the horrors of the British Raj. It's a useful reminder as we celebrate the anniversary of our republic of how, whatever problems today's India has, we are now at least 10 million times better off than we ever were under the empire. Let's look at the things the British claim to have given us. They claim to have given us the railways. Explain that.
Well, the railways were a big colonial scam, Veer, because essentially, from the days of Lord Dalhousie, it was very clear why they wanted to build railways. They wanted a way of accessing the Indian hinterland, which was too far for them to get through normal horse transport, and to be able to send workers in there to extract Indian resources, ship them to the ports, and get them out to England. So it was very much a tool of exploitation of the colony. Now, doing that, they decided to build railways, but they built railways in such a way that the Indian taxpayer would pay for his own exploitation and the British companies would profit from it. So that between about 1850 and about 1875, the single most profitable investment you could make on the London Stock Exchange was the Indian railways, because there was a guaranteed rate of return, even though the railways were not initially making any profits. As a result, there was no restriction on expenses. People spent left, right, and center because the Indians were paying for it. And each mile of Indian railway cost 9 times more than the same mile being built at the same time in the US, Canada, Australia, or the UK.
9 times more.
9 times more. That was what was going on. Then on top of that, of course, once they built it and were exploiting us, they ran it as a totally racist enterprise. Right until the First World War, every official except the most menial had to be Europeans. So even station masters and ticket collectors were Europeans. And they were, of course, paid gigantic salaries, and Indians were mistreated. It was only when in the First World War there was a worldwide shortage of European men and they were all dying in the trenches that they finally looked around and said, we've got to find people who look like the Europeans. So they went for the Anglo-Indians and then the Parsis, and that's how the identification of a few Indians with the railway industry started. Similarly, though the railway lines had no relationship to demand and supply of Indian travel needs, it was all for extractive purposes. Nonetheless, when they started attaching wagons with these ridiculous wooden benches, slats that passed for human accommodation, they charged Indian passengers the highest passenger rates in the world, while charging British companies the lowest freight rates in the world. So it was only after 1947, when we come to freedom, that Indians take this instrument of colonial domination and turn it around to serve our purposes. Whatever new lines were built after independence were to transport Indians from places they wanted to go to. And of course, conditions of travel were not only made more comfortable, but we charge now Indians the lowest passenger rates in the world. And sadly, in my view, charge Indian companies the highest freight rates of railways in the world. But that's a different argument. The point is, at least we were able to use the railways for our purposes only after the British had left.
Also, you touched on this, we forget how much color bar there was during the Raj.
Yeah.
There were institutions that Indians in their own country, in our own country, were specifically prohibited from entering, which were whites only.
Absolutely. In fact, I do tell the story, I think, of Jamshedji Tata being kicked out of a hotel in Bombay, which had a sign outside saying Indians and dogs not allowed. And then he built the Taj Mahal Hotel, which was, 10 times better than the hotel he was kicked out of. I don't know where the dogs could go, but the Indians suddenly were able to go to a classy place. And it's still surviving as one of the great hotels in the world.
They did put up a sign in protest at apartheid outside the Taj, which said no dogs and South Africans allowed.
I missed that. I would have included it if I'd known that. But anyway, the fact is that the hotel he was kicked out of is long since closed.
Yeah.
Whereas this survives.
One of the things that actually gets me very agitated, and I'm so glad you've touched on this in the book, is the sort of deification of Winston Churchill in England as though he was this great, massive leader, one of the greatest leaders of the world. In fact, he was pretty clearly and directly responsible for the Bengal famine, during which, 3 million people died?
4. Yeah, he was really one of the nastiest scoundrels.
A real unpleasant man. 6 million people were killed by Hitler, 4 million by Churchill. And yet we never even talk about the same president. Tell us about this.
Well, the thing about Churchill, on the Great Bengal famine, first of all, there's an entire history of British famine policy, which had notionally changed by the 1890s. But before that, what happened was that the British said, you can't help people in famines, because if they're going to die, they're meant to die. Number one, there is the law of the land, essentially, that says, free trade and market principles must prevail. You don't interfere. Secondly, the Malthusian principle that if the land can't sustain the population, then people should be allowed to die to restore the natural balance between land and population. And the third was the Victorian principle of fiscal prudence. Don't spend money you haven't budgeted for. So they refused to help in famines. The same applied to us, same applied to the Irish, which is why so many Irish ended up in America. The potato famine, the British had the same policy. But by the 1890s, in response to the outcries in the liberal press and in conscience-stricken people and so on, the policy had nominally changed. Nonetheless, 50 years later, Winston Churchill, as Prime Minister, instructs the government not to help the people dying of famine in Bengal, because famine, as you know, is about access to food. It's not about shortage of food. Food is there, but the people can't afford it because there's artificial scarcity thanks to wartime prices. What are they doing? They're purchasing grain grown in Bengal and shipping it to Europe to serve the war effort. Churchill said, I'm quoting his exact words, the starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis is less important than that of sturdy Tommies. But these sturdy Tommies weren't eating the grain. It was for reserve stocks in the event of a future possible invasion of Greece. Ships laden with wheat from Australia were calling at Calcutta port, and Churchill instructed they should not be allowed to disembark. They should carry on to Europe. This was the kind of cruelty. And time after time, there's indications of Churchill's personal intervention to prevent famine relief, even while he was getting reports of people dying. When conscience-stricken British officials sent the Prime Minister a report saying that our policies are killing Indians in large numbers, all Churchill could bring himself to do was to write in the margin peevishly, why hasn't Gandhi died yet?
Yep.
This is the appalling man who's being hailed by the British as some sort of apostle of freedom and democracy. He was irremediably evil.
This is the man who referred to Gandhi as a half-naked fakir.
That's right.
What is that quote?
Half-naked fakir striding up the steps of the palace to treat on equal terms with His Majesty the King Emperor.
Yeah. And yet this is just airbrushed out of Churchill history, isn't it?
Yeah, actually, there is. I remember an argument I had with his biographer, Roy Jenkins, the late British minister and politician. At the end of it, Jenkins turned around and said, you know what, I agree with you, he was racist. But when the British write about Churchill, they gloss it over. They don't talk about his racism.
If you look at the sort of scorecard, and the British keep saying they gave us many things, the rule of law we've dealt with, the railways we've dealt with, cricket, I suppose they did give us, and we've actually done quite well out of it. That leaves us only with the English language.
Anti.
Anti. But tea is not necessarily a good thing, as you point out, because it destroyed a lot of the ecology of Assam by
But also
planting.
they didn't intend it for us. They were using our land to grow tea to ship it to England. And it was only with the Great Depression, when they were suddenly stuck with a whole stock of unsold tea because the bottom had dropped out of the European market, that they had to create a market in India for our tea. And that's how Indians began to drink tea. Only in the 1930s that it had become a mass taste in India. So again, whether you like tea or not, and I'm an addict, I have to admit, 20 cups a day or so in my case, the fact still is that it wasn't intended for the likes of you and me. It was intended only for the Brits.
So the only thing they really have then is the English language, which they say they taught us, which ironically you and I are conducting this interview in. But it's interesting, they only make this claim about India. They never say, we taught the Americans to speak English. For some reason, it's just some extraordinary benefit they gave us, but not to anybody else.
Well, first of all, they didn't intend to give it to us either, Veer. If you read Macaulay's famous Minute on Education in 1835, the argument is very clear. He explicitly rejects the idea of teaching English to the Indian masses. He says, absolutely no way. Even though, of course, he dismissed all our languages as worthless and so on. He said the entire point is, we shouldn't have the trouble and expense of teaching Indians. We just educate a small class, a kind of buffer class to be interpreters between us and the people we're governing. The large unwashed masses can take care of themselves. And these guys would be, in that Macaulay's, that famous expression, Indians in taste, in blood and color, but English in taste and opinions and morals and in intellect. And this class was the only class that was meant to benefit. But of course, when education comes out of the bottle, you can't curb where it flows to. And what happened essentially was that Indians seized upon this instrument, both to acquire new and radical ideas, and to turn it against the British and make it into a language, an instrument of Indian nationalism. So again, the British, had they intended to use the language to educate us, fine. All they wanted to do is educate Indians enough, not to hold their own against the English, but to serve as clerks and petty officials to run the bureaucracies. By and large, these are people, the sort of caricatured Bengali Babu of Kipling's Kim or of many other 19th century books. That's all they were prepared to create.
Niraj Chaudhary, I mean, it was
Niraj Chaudhary did
particularly unpleasant caricature of Bengali Babu.
I personally am not a fan of his, but I have to say that they didn't even intend to have somebody who would write English as well as Niraj Chaudhary did. I mean, he was a master of the language that they taught him.
And he dedicated his book to the empire, which brought out the best in us, he said, yeah.
That what's it, livened and quickened the best in us or something. Quite embarrassing. But yeah, the thing about in every colonized society, because after all, colonization also colonizes our minds. Yeah. And many, like Niraj Chaudhary, their minds were colonized by British rule. But the fact is
colonized, enslaved, I mean, it's just a choice of words. Yeah? But tell me this, we've talked about their record, and I can see why they're in denial and they pretend they did us so much. But why are Indians so large-hearted? Why do we not feel any antipathy towards the British? Why are we just so willing to be friends?
Well, it was a very conscious decision by the nationalist movement to end all recrimination with August 15, 1947. In fact, there is an anecdote, perhaps apocryphal, but I heard it from a reliable source, that Churchill received Nehru about 10 years later in London and said, how come you feel no rancor and bitterness when we cost you so many years of your life, 10 years of your life in prisons? And Nehru is supposed to have said, I was taught by a great man, namely Mahatma Gandhi, never to fear and never to hate. That hatred is an unproductive emotion. And therefore, once it's over, we won our victory over you, we don't need to hate you. That was very much the thinking, the dominant thinking in the nationalist movement. We kept a lot of the British institutions. We kept the civil services, just renamed them. One thing that really surprises a lot of us is that the so-called heroes of the Indian National Army who fought under Subhash Chandra Bose were never reintegrated back into the Indian Army. Yes. They were actually cashiered because they betrayed their salt once. Whereas the Indian Army that had fought for the British became the Indian Army.
Became the heroes,
of free India. So it's a very interesting respect for tradition that we carried on. Is that because we are a forgiving people? I suppose to some degree it's in our blood. I mean, look how the Bangladeshis forgave the Pakistanis who butchered 1 million of them. So anything, I suppose, is possible in our subcontinent. But in any case, I don't particularly now want to stoke up any new recriminations or bitterness. To my mind, our relationship with Britain today is of two sovereign equal countries. Our economy has just overtaken theirs in absolute terms. We don't need to have a chip on the shoulder about it. But we do need to see history on its own terms, to confront the past for its own sake. which is what I've tried to do in this book.
As you may have noticed, I didn't argue with too many of Shashi's conclusions. That's simple. It's because I share them. It's easy now to cast a nostalgic look back at the empire. But never fall into that trap. The Raj was an unspeakable atrocity against humanity itself. Indians are not a vindictive people, so we may forgive. But we must never ever forget. That's it for this time. We'll see you again next week. Goodbye. And take pride in our republic. It is something that every Indian should cherish.